I still remember the exact moment my life split into before and after. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early September when I was sitting in a broken-down Greyhound bus on the corner of 5th and Madison, and an old man with weathered hands asked me if my father's name was Richard. The color completely drained from my face, because I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 17 years. My brother had made sure of that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to where this nightmare actually began, because you need to understand who I was before everything changed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Portland, Oregon in a modest 2-story house with my parents and my brother David. David is 3 years older than me, and for the first 25 years of my life, I genuinely believed he was the most honorable person I would ever know. He was the kind of brother who helped with homework, who drove you to school when your car broke down, who remembered your birthday even when life got chaotic. The kind of person who made you feel like you were never alone. But that's the thing about lies. The best ones taste exactly like the truth, and by the time you realize you've been poisoned, you've already swallowed. My parents died when I was 8 years old. A car accident on Highway 101 during a rainstorm. I have fragmented memories of that day, the kind that feel more like dreams than reality. There's a police officer with a kind face. There's my mother's favorite blue sweater that smelled like her perfume. There's David holding my hand in a sterile waiting room while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. What I don't have are answers. What I don't have is time. Our grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was supposed to be our lifeline. He was wealthy, according to whispers I overheard at the funeral. Successful in real estate. Respected in the community, and completely absent when we needed him most. David told me the story so many times that I stopped questioning it. Our grandfather had disowned our father years before. There was a rift, a disagreement about money, about values, about whether our father had married the right woman. According to David, our grandfather wanted nothing to do with us. He refused to acknowledge us as his heirs. He cut off all contact and made it clear that we would receive nothing from his estate when the time came. And so we were raised by David. He was only 11 when our parents died, but he stepped into the role of guardian with a maturity that seemed impossible for a child. He fought with social services. He kept us together when we could have been separated into the foster care system. He made sure we had a roof over our heads and food on the table and clothes that fit, even when it meant working part-time jobs after school, while trying to maintain his own grades. Everyone praised him. Teachers, social workers, family, friends. They all marveled at his resilience, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to keeping our family intact. And I loved him for it. I genuinely did. I was so grateful that I never questioned anything he told me. Not even when the details didn't quite add up. Not even when I found an old letter in his desk drawer when I was 14 with grandfather's handwriting on the envelope, a letter that seemed to be from him, though David said he'd never received any communication. I showed it to David, and he gently explained that it was an old thing, sent years before the complete estrangement, and that it didn't change anything.
He was so calm about it.
So reasonable. He explained that our grandfather had tried to reach out once, but by then the damage was done. By then it was too late. I believed him, because I desperately wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too painful to consider. If our grandfather hadn't completely disowned us, if he'd actually wanted a relationship with us, then David had kept that from me. David had lied, and I wasn't ready to live in a world where that was true. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. College was supposed to be my escape. I'd worked so hard in high school, maintained nearly a 4-point GPA, gotten involved in debate and student government, and every extracurricular activity I could manage. I had scholarship offers from 3 universities. I was going to study law. I was going to build a life that wasn't defined by grief and loss and dependency. David encouraged me. He seemed genuinely proud. He told me I deserved this. He told me I was going to do amazing things. But then senior year of college came, and there was an emergency. A property issue with the house. A legal complication that required immediate attention. David explained it with such detailed precision that it sounded almost routine. There was a mortgage acceleration clause. The lender was threatening foreclosure. He needed my signature on some documents to consolidate our assets and protect our home. I was confused. We'd always owned the house outright, or so I thought. But David explained the finances in a way that made my head spin. He used terms I didn't understand. He showed me documents that looked legitimate.
He was so calm about it.
So in control. So certain that everything would be fine if I just signed my name on the dotted line. I didn't question him. I signed. 2 weeks later, I made a mistake. I called the bank to verify something David had mentioned about the mortgage, and they told me I didn't have an account with them. There was no mortgage. There had never been a mortgage. The house had been paid off when our parents died, and the title had been transferred into David's name when he turned 18. I hung up the phone and called David immediately. He explained that the bank employee must have been confused, that these things happened all the time, that I shouldn't worry about it. He was so reassuring, so protective, so careful to make me feel like I was paranoid for doubting him. And maybe I was. Maybe I was overthinking a simple misunderstanding. I was exhausted from school. I was stressed about my future. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me.
So I let it go.
I quit college that same year. David said it was temporary. He said once things stabilized financially, I could finish my degree. But things never stabilized. David said I should move into an apartment near his office, so he could keep helping me while I figured out what I wanted to do. I worked retail jobs and restaurant positions and administrative roles that never led anywhere. I watched my friends graduate and move away. I watched them build careers and buy homes and get married and have families. And I stayed in Portland, trapped in a loop that felt impossible to break. David was always there to help, though. Always there to save me. When my car broke down, he paid for the repairs. When I couldn't make rent, he covered the difference. When I was sick, he brought me soup and medicine and sat with me until I felt better. He was the kindest person I knew, the most generous, the most selfless, and I was completely dependent on him. By my mid-20s, I barely remembered who I was supposed to be. That girl who was going to study law felt like someone I'd read about in a book, not someone I actually was. I'd become a ghost living in someone else's charity. And then my car broke down for real in September. Not the kind of breakdown that could be fixed with a quick trip to the mechanic. The transmission was shot. The engine was dying. It would cost more money than I had to repair it. David was traveling for business. He wouldn't be back for a week. And I had to get to work. So I did something I'd never done before. I took the bus. It was a gray afternoon with clouds hanging low over the city. The bus smelled like diesel and old upholstery and the particular sadness that seems to accumulate in public transit. I was standing near the back because all the good seats were taken, holding onto a metal pole with my forehead pressed against the cool window, thinking about how my life had somehow become so small. That's when the old man sat down. He was wearing a tan coat that had seen better days. His shoes were polished despite their age. His hands had the kind of wrinkles that come from a lifetime of work, but they were still elegant somehow. He smiled at me with genuine kindness. "Long day?" he asked. It was such a simple question. Such an ordinary thing that a stranger might say to another stranger on a bus. But something about his voice made me answer truthfully. I told him yes. I told him I was having a particularly difficult few years, actually. I told him that sometimes I felt like I'd lost myself so completely that I wasn't sure I'd ever find my way back. I don't know why I told him these things. I don't tell anyone these things. But there was something about him that felt safe. Something about the way he listened that made me feel like he actually cared about the answer, not just making polite conversation. He introduced himself as Robert. He told me that he'd been through difficult seasons too, that sometimes the hardest part about being lost is that you stop looking for the way home. He asked about my family. He asked if I had siblings. And when I mentioned David, something shifted in his expression. It was barely perceptible. a slight tightening around his eyes, a hesitation before he spoke. "What's your father's name?" he asked.
Was.
Was not is. He passed away when I was 8. His name was Richard. I watched the color drain from the old man's face. I watched him grip the armrest so hard that his knuckles turned white. I watched him take a breath like he was surfacing from deep underwater. "Your father's name was Richard," he repeated quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "How did you?" But then the bus pulled up to a stop, and he stood with effort, like his body had suddenly become much heavier. He looked at me with an intensity that was almost frightening. He said, "My name is Robert Mitchell, and I think I may be your grandfather." Everything after that moment exists in my memory like a film that was shot slightly out of focus. He gave me his address. He asked me to visit him. He said there were things I needed to know. Important things. Things that had been hidden from me for far too long. I remember nodding. I remember taking his address and writing it down with shaking hands. I remember him getting off the bus and watching through the window as he walked away, moving slowly, like he was carrying something incredibly heavy. When I got home that evening, I did something I'd never done before. I searched for him. Robert Mitchell. It took only minutes. He appeared in old newspaper articles about real estate development in Portland during the 1980s and 1990s. He appeared in property records. He appeared in photographs standing beside buildings he'd constructed, smiling with pride. And in one of those photographs, standing next to him, was a man who looked exactly like a younger version of my father. The article was dated 1984. It said that Richard Mitchell, the son of prominent Portland developer Robert Mitchell, had partnered with his father to develop a mixed-use complex on the waterfront. They were smiling in that photograph. They looked proud. They looked like they actually liked each other. I sat on my apartment floor for 3 hours staring at that photograph.
I didn't call David.
I didn't text him.
I didn't do anything.
I just sat there and tried to reconcile the image in front of me with everything I'd been told. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. My mind was racing in 1,000 directions at once. That night, I called Robert. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for me. We talked for hours. He told me the real story. He told me that he and my father had been close, that they'd worked together, that they'd had dreams of building something meaningful in Portland together. He told me that when my parents died, he had immediately wanted to help us. He had wanted to be there for David and me. But David had refused him. David had told him that we didn't want anything to do with him. David had said that our grandfather was toxic, that he was controlling, that he had tried to manipulate the family through his wealth. Robert said that David had been so convincing, so articulate, so certain in his accusations, that Robert had gradually accepted that perhaps his own child had been right about him, that perhaps he had been overbearing, that perhaps the best thing he could do for us was to step back and let us grieve in peace. So he had stepped back. He had stayed away. But he had never forgotten us. And he had never stopped loving my father. When I asked about the inheritance, his voice broke. He told me that he had left everything to my father in his will. Substantial money, property, a legacy. But when my father died, he had updated his will to make David and me the beneficiaries instead. He said he wanted us to have opportunities. He wanted us to have the education he couldn't pay for before, to have the freedom to build lives that weren't constrained by financial insecurity. He said he had tried to tell David this. He said David had refused to listen. He said David had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with the Mitchell estate and that he was going to raise me on his own terms, without his father's influence or money. So Robert had respected that. He had honoring his son's wishes, even though it broke his heart. Even though it meant watching his only grandchildren grow up without him. Even though it meant relinquishing his connection to the only part of his son that remained on Earth. I asked why he never tried to reach out to me directly. His answer was so quiet I almost couldn't hear it. He said that he had been afraid. Afraid that David had poisoned me against him. Afraid that I would reject him just like my brother had. Afraid that if he pushed, he would lose us completely. So he had chosen to do nothing. He had chosen to live with the silence. And then one day, years later, He had decided he didn't care about being afraid anymore. He had decided that at his age, with however many years he had left, it was better to risk rejection than to spend them in absence. He had gotten on that bus on a Tuesday in September.
And he had found me.
The next morning, I called David. I didn't mention Robert. I didn't mention anything. I simply asked him directly. I asked him if grandfather had tried to contact us after our parents died. Asked him if grandfather had wanted to help us. I asked him if grandfather had left us his estate. There was a long silence on the phone. Then David said, "Who told you that?" The way he asked it was enough. It was everything. I heard the panic beneath the calm. I heard the fear beneath the control. I heard the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed lie was finally starting to unravel. I told him I had gotten on the bus and talked to an old man, and that old man had given me his name, and the internet had done the rest. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line. I could hear him calculating his next move. David had always been so good at this. So good at thinking 5 steps ahead. So good at knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, listen to me. That man is not well. He's an old man with dementia. He's confused about what happened. I didn't want to tell you this because I was trying to protect you, but he became obsessed with us after our parents died. He blamed himself for the distance between him and Dad. He had a mental breakdown. He started making accusations. He started claiming that he'd left us everything, but that wasn't true. He never left us anything. He was a lonely old man who wanted to believe he had a close relationship with his son, and when reality didn't match that fantasy, he created an alternate version of events. He showed up at our house when you were sleeping. He called constantly. He would leave letters in the mailbox. He was harassing us. And I handled it. I made it stop. And I decided that the kinder thing was to let you believe he wanted nothing to do with us, rather than traumatize you with the truth about his mental illness. It was brilliant. It was the kind of lie that was built on just enough truth that it felt real. There was just enough concern in his voice that it made me want to believe him. There was just enough love in his protestation that it felt like he was doing this for my sake. I had 26 years of him being reliable, being trustworthy, being the person I trusted most in the world. It would have been so easy to believe him. It would have been so easy to dismiss Robert as a confused old man and return to the life I'd been living. But something in me had changed. Something had broken loose. And I realized for the first time since I was 8 years old that I had the power to verify things for myself. I didn't need David to tell me what was true. I could find out.
So I did.
I hired a lawyer, a family law attorney named Patricia, who had kind eyes and an ability to explain complicated legal concepts in plain English. Patricia pulled the property records. Patricia pulled the will. Patricia pulled the bank records. And everything Robert had told me was true. Everything David had told me was a lie. Our grandfather had left us his entire estate. Millions of dollars.
Properties.
Investments. A legacy that could have changed the course of our lives if David had allowed it. Instead, David had forged our signatures on documents. He had convinced the estate attorney that he was acting in our best interest. He had gradually consolidated the assets into accounts he controlled. He had been living off of our inheritance the entire time, while telling me that he was struggling to support us both. The house we lived in wasn't his. It was ours. The money he gave me wasn't charity. It was our own money. He had simply positioned himself as our savior while quietly committing what amounts to grand theft. Patricia explained that we could pursue legal action. She explained that there was more than enough evidence for a criminal case. She explained that David could face significant prison time. She explained that I could reclaim the money, the property, the life that had been stolen from me. And I did something that surprised even myself. I asked for a month before we took action. I asked Patricia to give me time to process this. Because even now, even knowing what I know, there's a part of me that loves David. There's a part of me that remembers the 11-year-old boy who held my hand in a hospital waiting room. There's a part of me that recognizes his sacrifice, even if it was wrapped up in the most terrible kind of betrayal. A month later, I met with Robert again. We met at a coffee shop on Morrison Street. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of the truth was finally crushing him. He told me that he'd tried everything to reach out to us over the years. He told me that he'd written letters that never got answered. He told me that he'd hired detectives to find us, only to discover that David had severed our connection to him so completely that even locating us felt like an act of trespassing. He told me that every birthday he would sit alone in his house and wonder what I looked like, whether I was happy, whether I was safe, whether I had become the person I was meant to be. He told me that when he saw me on the bus, it was the answer to a prayer he'd stopped believing in. We didn't reconcile immediately. Reconciliation isn't a moment. It's a process. It's months and years of rebuilding something that was fractured beyond recognition. But we started. We started with coffee. We moved to lunch. We moved to him teaching me about our family history, about the real story of my father, about who I actually was underneath all the lies. I learned that my father had been brilliant, that he had dreams of architecture, that he had wanted to build things that would last, that he had loved my mother desperately, and that they were planning to have more children when they died. I learned that my grandfather had loved my father so much that it had broken him when his son was taken away. I learned that my grandfather had mourned not just my father, but me as well. A granddaughter he was never allowed to know. 2 months after I found Robert on the bus, I filed charges against David. I watched as my brother was arrested. I watched as he was arraigned. I watched as the carefully constructed life he had built on my back came crashing down. He was convicted of financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I watched him walk out of the courthouse handcuffed, and I felt nothing. That's what surprised me the most. I expected to feel something. Vindication, anger, relief, justice. But there was nothing. There was just the hollow understanding that David was gone from my life in a way that was now permanent and irreversible. My brother had been a ghost all along. I just hadn't known it. I used the money to finish my education. I went back to college and completed my degree. I got into law school. I became exactly what I'd wanted to be when I was 18 years old, before the lies started. And every morning, I wake up in an apartment that I own with money in my account that belongs to me, in a life that is finally actually mine. Robert and I had lunch every Sunday until he died. He passed away 2 years after we reconnected, peacefully and in his sleep, knowing that he had been found. Knowing that his granddaughter had chosen to seek the truth. Knowing that love, even when it's separated by lies and years and silence, can still cross the distance. The last thing he said to me was that I had become the woman he always knew I could be, that he was proud of me, that he loved me, and that he forgave David, even if David never forgave himself. Here's what I've learned from all of this. Lies are constructed carefully. They're built on moments of vulnerability and shaped by our desperation to believe the people we love. Liars don't announce themselves. They position themselves as our protectors. They make us feel safe while they're taking everything from us. And the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, always comes up eventually. It always comes up. Sometimes it takes 17 years. Sometimes it takes an old man on a bus and a kind question about your family. But it always comes out. If you made it this far, you understand what it means when the truth finally arrives. You understand the weight of it. You understand how it can shatter everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. I want to know what you would have done. If you were in my position, if you had discovered a lie that fundamental, would you have pursued justice? Would you have protected your brother? Would you have asked for forgiveness? Would you have believed the lie when he told it to you so calmly, so reasonably, so convincingly? I'd love to hear what you would have done differently. Comment below and tell me. Tell me your story if you have one. Tell me if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted. Tell me if you've ever discovered a truth that changed everything. Because these stories matter. These stories about what happens when love becomes a weapon, when family becomes a lie, when the truth finally surfaces and forces us to rebuild. They matter because they remind us that we're not alone. They matter because they show us that there's always a chance to reclaim our lives, even after years of losing them. Tell me your story. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. And let's keep proving that truth is always worth fighting for.